The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle, Chapter 12, Under the City. "Execute me," Kaleb gasped. "But why?" Freyland helped Kaleb to his feet and motioned for him to follow Amber into the small house. "We must get inside," said Freyland. Soon, the three of them were seated on crudely made stools. Amber poured something like a vegetable stew into a metal dish and handed it to her guest. Then, in motherly fashion, she brushed some dirt off the edge of Kaleb's filthy tunic. "According to my daughter," Amber said, "the elder suspicions were alarmed when they saw that you had disappeared the morning after the branch was severed. It led them to conclude that you were involved in a plot to steal the limb from their sacred tree." "How did you find us out here, Kaleb Dellblood?" Freyland said. Kaleb swallowed a large gulp of the watery stew and nodded gratefully before answering Freyland's question. I don't know exactly. I was lost in the forest a good distance from here, and then a mist filled up the woods. I heard a whisper, a lovely whisper. I followed the sound of it until I arrived here, outside your dwelling, and then I heard your voices inside and drew close to listen." Freyland gave Amber a look that was hard for Kaleb to interpret. Kaleb sipped at the stew again, his lips pressed against the side of the bowl. Amber spoke up. "Where did you last see my daughter?" "I saw her in a clearing several hundred yards to the south." "Why did you not speak to her?" "I couldn't. She was taken by scouts, likely the same scouts that abducted some of my companions yesterday." Freyland's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Amber said. "Did you hear any of her kidnappers' names?" said Freyland. "Did they identify themselves?" "Yes, only one." "Elslin?" Kaleb pronounced it slowly. The expression on Freyland's face hardened. He shot a dark look at his lover. "So, Verliston has been using our scouts to patrol the deep forests," he said. "I figured as much. Where did they take her, Kaleb?" "I don't know. It all happened about a half-mile from here, in a clearing to the south. They said they would have to smuggle her into the city, sometime before morning. She was with a wolf, too, a companion of mine." "A wolf?" said Freyland. "Do you mean they captured an animal?" "Yes," said Kaleb. He wasn't sure how to explain that a secret city of animals, concealed for centuries, existed in the forest just a few miles east of their current location. "Strange," Freyland mumbled. "We have no animals in these woods, or at least we haven't for many centuries. What were they going to do with her? With Madge, I mean. Was she harmed?" "No one was harmed, but they mentioned giving her to someone as a prize," said Kaleb. "Was it Verliston?" Amber said. "I believe so." All the color drained from Amber's face. Freyland said, "We must leave at once, Kaleb. I will take you to Ablerin. Perhaps together we can keep Madge out of that vile woman's clutches." Freyland took his small ornate sword from its scabbard. Then he picked up a cloth from the table at which the three of them were sitting. He wiped each edge of the narrow blade. "Do you know how to use a weapon?" he said to Kaleb, motioning by a nod toward the axe in Kaleb's belt. "Not well." "You better learn quickly, then. You may need to use that axe before the sun rises." With this, Freyland slid his sword back into its scabbard. A half-hour later, Kaleb and Freyland were hiking briskly toward Ablerin. The trek through the woods outside Ablerin grew easier as the morning broke and pale light saturated the woods enclosing them. Not far from the deep, thick forest of Ablerin, where Amber concealed herself from the Dellbloods and the Stonerenders, the trees began to thin out. And not long after the two men had set out, Freyland stepped out of dense brush onto a man-made path that wound its way through a more open stretch of forest. Kaleb found it hard to keep pace with Freyland's swift, determined steps. But soon the two of them were out of the woods entirely. They crossed a wide, rock-strewn plain that led up towards a bluish-gray mountain in the distance. Near the opposite edge of the broad plain and close to the base of the mountain, Kaleb caught the twinkle of something, a large, jagged shape in the distance. "Is that your city?" "Yes," Freyland said. "It's made almost entirely of stone and metal, of course. We mine these mountains for the ore used to build our tools and swords. The people of Ablerin are fine metal workers, but the trees in our forest are hard to fell, so we often barter for wood from your people." "Where did you get that sword?" Kaleb said. "It is wonderfully crafted." "It is my work," said Freyland, flashing a proud smile. Kaleb stared at its beautifully engraved hilt. "Don't be too impressed, Dellblood," Freyland said. "All stonerenders build their own swords as a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. Fortunately, we rarely have to use them." "Do the women also fashion swords?" said Kaleb, remembering Glista's equally ornate blade. "Rarely. Our scouts are recruited as boys, trained from their earliest days to defend the precious metals in our mountains. To my memory, only one girl was ever permitted to join our ranks, and that was by Verlisden's special dispensation." "Only one, you say?" "That's right." "Was she a good fighter, this young woman?" "Yes, she was among our best," said Freyland. "But she went missing a few weeks ago. Our scouts worried that she was kidnapped, and Verlisden insists, though I find it hard to believe, that the Dellbloods are behind this girl's disappearance." Kaleb could now see the lines of the distant city more clearly against the sinking moon. Ablerin's stony exterior was majestic and towering. The two men continued on in silence for some time. Later, Kaleb said, "What will happen to you if you combat the scouts who kidnapped your daughter? Won't you face punishment if you try to take Madge back from Verlisden?" Freyland stopped. He took a deep breath and laid his hand on the metal sword hilt that rose above the blade's sheath. "It's hard to calculate, but I have no doubt my chance of surviving an open battle with Verlisden's loyal scouts is slim. There are too many of them for me to defeat alone, even with the assistance of a strong man like you." Here he nodded respectfully to Kaleb. "But all that is nothing. My only concern is to retrieve my daughter from Verlisden. She is known to handle prisoners with cruelty, and she is more clever than her rivals among the elders know. What is more, if Verlisden discovers that my daughter is a half-breed, she will play on the stonerender's ancient superstitions to have Madge condemned as a bad omen." "How will we find Madge?" said Kaleb. Freyland's brow narrowed. "I suspect she'll be imprisoned far under the mountain, in the dungeons reserved for our worst criminals. That is where Verlisden is most likely to conceal her, out of sight, and where she stands little chance of escaping." Though panting as they ascended the steep incline toward the city, Kaleb managed to ask, "How did this Verlisden become so powerful, if she is as horrible as you say?" "How does anyone become powerful in politics? Through fear and by lies. Or else, I would presume, by great courage, but she has never shown that," Freyland said flatly. An hour later, the two men reached the base of the mountain, approaching from the north so as not to alert anyone to their presence. By now, light had fringed the mountain peaks above the stone city, casting tall shadows down into the valley below Ablerin. In short order, Kaleb and Freyland arrived at an outcropping about 40 yards below a small stone door carved into the city's northern wall. "Give me your axe," Freyland said, extending his rough hand. Kaleb, for the first time, noticed the blade scars in the scout's palm. After a moment of hesitation, Kaleb yielded to Freyland's commanding air. He laid his tool in the stonerender's hand. "Keep your head low," said Freyland. "Until I say otherwise, you are a captive." They continued their ascent. Minutes later, Kaleb and Freyland came upon a scout dressed in black. The guard, who had draped a thick blanket around his shoulders, stood up from where he was sleepily reclining at the door. Freylin, it's good to see that you have returned safely from your nightly patrol, he stammered. Rumors are circulating that Dellblood spies, and perhaps even wild beasts, have been roaming the woods of Ableron. Have you heard any of this? Yes, said Freylin. These are not just rumors. In fact, I discovered this Dellblood wandering in the deep woods last night. At this, the guard squinted in the waxing light to get a look at the broad-shouldered captive. But do not concern yourself with that, Freylin continued in an even tone. He is a petty criminal, fleeing the just punishment of his people's elders. I will take him directly to Verlisden, if that is all right with you. Why, yes, of course, said the guard, leering at Kaleb's filthy tunic and skinned-up knees. She will know what to do with a scoundrel like him, he added. The guard drew the heavy door back on its rusty hinges. Freylin nodded at the doorkeeper once more as he and Kaleb passed through the doorway into the city of Ableron. Ableron's streets were just beginning to fill with sleepy citizens as dawn flooded the alleys and cast a greenish glow over the stone renders' pale faces. For the first time, Kaleb got a glimpse of their people's common garb. Those who were not scouts wore dark garments, mostly gray and black, woven to be much thicker and warmer than the tunics worn by the Dellbloods, who lived in the lowlands of Parison and enjoyed a warmer climate. As two older women passed them, Kaleb noticed that their hair had been chopped short near the base of their skulls. When he glanced backward at them, the reason became clear. Just below these women's hair, at the base of each woman's neck, Kaleb caught sight of an ornate mark, quite similar in shape and size to the mark on each Dellblood's forehead. This must have been the stone render's mark, equivalent to the symbol engraved on the foreheads of his own people. A few of the stone renders passing in the streets shot confused glances at Kaleb, whose Dellblood tunic, though stained dark with mud, looked foreign to them. He bent his face toward the ground again, heeding Freylin's earlier instruction about acting the part of a captive. Freylin passed into an alleyway and then led Kaleb by a broad opening through a wall into a tall room that looked like a barracks. The chamber was filled with swords mounted to the walls and black uniforms draped over what looked like metal arms fastened to the steep walls. If we're lucky, said Freylin, your dark complexion will not draw suspicion against the dim light of the underground chambers, and, as fortune would have it, your unmarked forehead will allow you to blend in more easily with our people. He handed Kaleb a stone render scout's uniform. But we must discard your Dellblood tunic here, and hope that your chopping axe and blue eyes do not draw the attention of my people. Try not to look directly at anyone you pass from here on out. Kaleb donned the tight-fitting black garment. Then he used the sash of the uniform to strap his axe, the head of which Freylin concealed in a strip of fabric torn out of Kaleb's tunic, onto Kaleb's back. Freylin picked up a piece of cold charcoal from a hearth along the edge of the room and told Kaleb to turn around. Why? Said Kaleb. You must be marked, said Freylin. The scout rubbed the black charcoal in a twisting pattern along the back of Kaleb's neck. There, he said. It's not perfect, but no one who stands at a distance will suspect the mark is counterfeit. The two of them slipped out of the barracks. After maneuvering through several more alleyways, Freylin and Kaleb reached a position that must have been, by Kaleb's glance up at the dense stack of towers around him, somewhere near the center of Ableron. Freylin leaned against a nearby wall and peered up and down the alley. No other stone renders were in sight. The scouts who took Madge and the wolf must already have arrived, whispered Freylin to Kaleb, or we would have caught up to them on our way to the city. Stay close to me, for we are about to enter a secret place. Say nothing, and move as discreetly as possible. With that, Freylin ushered Kaleb into another narrow passageway between two large stone structures. Then, after gently opening a metal door, Freylin led the Dellblood down a crude flight of stone steps that wound for several minutes toward an underground chamber. There, torches were lit and mounted in metal sconces on the walls. As they descended, Kaleb heard voices coming from below. Soon the two of them reached a landing that opened out into a narrow hallway with tall, cobweb-covered stone walls. Fralin edged out into the hallway, but stopped short of an entrance into what sounded, by the echoes of the voices inside, to be a vast, open chamber. The firelight coming from inside this room cast an eerie glow on the stone walls opposite the chamber's entrance. Fralin leaned his head forward, just far enough to get a look at what was going on inside the room. He exhaled slowly. "She has 2 female prisoners, one tied up to a chair," he whispered, leaning in close to Kaleb's ear. "There are cages with beasts as well," he said. "Come, this room has a balcony. Let's make our way up there to get a closer look." Kaleb followed Fralin back up the narrow passageway to a separate staircase. These steps led toward a hallway that circled the chamber as far as Kaleb could tell. Through another opening, they were able to slip out onto the balcony. Crouching behind the wide banister, they peered out between the narrow columns to get a look at the chamber below.